welcome everyone to the SPF digital series on what next for where we live. This is obviously a topic that generates a lot of interest, and we've got people joining from both sides of the border, from local authorities, from developers, and from our trusted advisors. And we're very grateful to you all for joining us today. The topic, I think, is important because of obviously government carbon commitments, and perhaps for some of us also personal carbon commitments, and the fact that change has been happening anyway in terms of the world of work, and work becoming more flexible over time, and how this effect may be accelerated by the current pandemic, and the things we're going through. And also the structural changes that have been taking place in our cities and how they work. And that change again being perhaps accelerated by the pandemic. Internationally, the same sort of changes are also taking place. And we see, for example, that the mayor of Paris was elected partly on a platform of aiming to deliver change to the city and deliver the idea of 15 to 20-minute neighbourhoods in Paris as well. So today we have a panel for you of experts to speak about some of these issues and explore them a bit further. They're all going to make a presentation, and once they've completed their presentations, it's open to everybody. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to lodge your questions, and we'll work our way through them as far as we can. If you can just avoid using the chat function and just stick to the Q&A, it'll be easier to manage that process. So our panelists today, first up is Forbes Barron from the Glasgow City Council, and he's going to present on Glasgow's initiative to move towards the 15 to 20-minute neighbourhoods. And he's going to be followed by Richard MacDonald, well-known Scottish architect from Keppie Design, and he's going to speak more about how we work, and the way that changes will come to how we work, and then followed up by Ranald Boydell from Ecohouse, and he's going to speak a little more about our homes and the likely changes that we're going to experience in our homes. So I'm going to hand over first to Forbes, and he's going to make his presentation to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here with you virtually this afternoon. It brings into sharp focus that as we meet in the midst of the pandemic with its huge social, economic and environmental impacts, the importance of our communities and the impact on the ability to deliver services is brought to the fore. We are hugely dependent upon the web for our resilience, as you can see at the moment, and our immediate environment, social structures and economic interactions, many of which are historical, will come to the fore. In my comments in the next few minutes, will talk about the place-based context of where I live and work in Glasgow, which sits at the centre of Scotland's only metropolitan conurbation with a third of the country's economy. It has particularly uneven spatial and economic and health outcomes, with a high concentration of flatted accommodation, which is, I think, particularly important in terms of access to green space over the last few months that we've been through. So maybe we could move to the next slide, please. If I share the thinking behind the principle of the 15 to 20-minute neighbourhood, let's call it a 20-minute neighbourhood for simplicity. As Michaela said, it's not a thing unique to Scotland. It's been utilised particularly in Paris, but in other global cities. It builds upon the long-established notion that people should have access to most daily needs within 20 minutes of their home, reducing travel to work and transport demand and promoting those local neighbourhoods. Such a city represents the possibility of a resilient and decentralised city, and perhaps cuts across some of the historic planning responses of putting the city into discrete zones for living, working and entertainment. At its heart are mosaics of neighbourhoods where almost all the needs of the residents can be met. If you look in terms of the Glasgow city centre, next slide please, We have over 40 town centres, if you include the city centre as well, within that hierarchy. Now, the current crisis and the need for social distancing and spaces for people have in the short term created in the city centre a bit of a cone city, but beneath that, it shows us the possibility of rediscovering proximity, as well as the design challenge and importance of having place-based design and quality that links together all those bike paths and some lane closures. The 20-minute neighbourhood is also in the Scottish Government Programme for Government, which was published in September this year. That focuses upon, for example, low carbon, but also talks about working with local government to take forward the ambitions for the 20-minute neighbourhood, where people can live and work and learn in communities close to home. Importantly, it commits £500 million of spending towards transformative infrastructure for such projects to assist that, access to bikes and behavioural change. And talks about introducing low emission zones across Scotland's major cities. Of course, Glasgow already has the front end of that process. It's important as well in terms of that 20-minute neighbourhood, for example, in the larger centres, that we don't have centres which become quiet and perhaps less inviting and less safe in the evenings and weekends, and ensure that these centres are diverse. We also have to ensure that these centres are resilient in terms of the climate emergency, which is very much to the fore at the present time. So if I look towards how this model applies in Glasgow, could I have the next slide, please? The existing city plan was adopted in 2017, and in terms of the SPP, the Scottish Planning Policy context, had 4 outcomes. It looks towards a vibrant economy, sustainable city, a connected city, and a green city. So those outcomes are very much reflected in the morphing, which you'll have seen perhaps this week, that the Scottish Government are currently consulting on the current stage of national planning framework. That kind of just starts to adjust those outcomes towards net zero emissions, resilient communities, a well-being economy, and greener, better places. Importantly, it flags up in terms of the national planning framework next year that we'll be applying the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods with the potential to reduce emissions and improve our health and well-being. That also sits within the programme for government too, which notes that that concept doesn't sit in isolation, but actually scales up to the larger geographies and networked areas, which I think is really important because the city competes at an international and European scale, as well as at everyday neighbourhood level. So that 20 minutes that we referred to there could be seen at operating a number of levels. If you're walking and cycling, it might be 1 to 5 miles in 20 minutes. But if you're on the suburban rail network in the city, which is the largest outside London, that could be perhaps in the order of 15 miles. So I think a really key point is that the 20-minute label for Glasgow should serve mainly as a useful shorthand to communicate the city's goals with residents and investors. Now, the high quality, walkable and accessible environments are increasingly recognised as providing strategic competitive advantage to retain people and investment. So I think it's important that we bank that issue, because that's important in terms of the future economic underpin, because at the end of this pandemic, we'll need to see where our economy actually sits. Next slide, please. Let's not pretend we're there yet. This is a particularly striking image. It's not part of my presentation. I captured it as a screenshot this morning off the web. This is, I think, a consultancy who are looking to have a design focus around the COP26 in the city next November, dealing with global challenges in a local urban context. If you reflect upon this powerful image, it may go some way suggesting why the 20-minute shorthand is really important in communicating the city's goals. Next slide, please. If you look at a SWOT analysis, perhaps, and scenario testing for the city moving forward, the cultural and physical assets and the knowledge-based economy of the city are hugely important for our future growth and prosperity, which underpins everything. And that metropolitan and everyday needs need to work together to deal with the uneven outcomes in the conurbation. Undoubtedly, the city and the town centres will have accelerated change in role, and we need to have an evidential basis to positively support the appropriate adaptation. We've seen only this week with Arcadia and Debenhams the acceleration of existing retail change. And in the public sector, we need to look towards the spatial alignment of public service provision under budget pressures. In terms of the changing employment and travel patterns, we'll need to look towards, again, an evidential basis as that emerges on the recovery from the pandemic as to what becomes the eventual new norm. And ensuring that it's a compact urban form, we've got to make sure we integrate both the green space and connectivity, but also reuse the vacant and derelict land within the context of a climate emergency. Next slide, please. So if we look towards the City Development Plan scheme, which was published in September this year, we have looked towards the process by which we move into City Development Plan 2. I suppose the direction of travel is that planning policy will need to do largely what it's been trying to do for some time, set the parameters for new development for as high a standard as possible, and providing those living in it and working with it with a good quality environment. Of course, looking at the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood is a useful tool to actually assist us in that move. The Scottish Government will be consulting on the proposals for local place planning as an important part of the new Act in early 2021. And Glasgow has used the opportunity to pilot the Future Fox Place Builder as a dashboard, which actually provides defensible data and spatial insight with cutting-edge analytics. If you want to contribute towards that consultation, it's still open for another week. We also expect there to be an additional call for sites in the next year as well to supplement that which already took place in 2018. We'll also be expecting to respond to evidence arising from the Place Commission, which is appointed by the City Government and has workshops until the end of this year. Next slide, please. The open space strategy, which is specifically intended to deliver a network of open space within 400 meters of where people live, is currently under preparation as well. And if that's seen as just being an academic issue, I would draw your attention to the study, I think it was the Glasgow School of Art, in terms of the impact of the canal corridor on the north of the city, one of the most deprived areas of the conurbation, where over the last 10 years, health outcomes have been divergent in a very positive way from the rest of the north of the city as a direct result of the canal and its regeneration. Next slide, please. We need to be robust in supporting the 20-minute city centre. If daily population flows for work, education and shopping are under scrutiny, ensuring activity beyond focused parts of the day, then we need to actually look towards the place-based solutions within that. Next slide, please. Population growth near centres is important. For example, in the city centre, this is a slide of Sighthill, a master planned 20-minute neighbourhood, which is on site as we speak, with a 10-minute walking time down to George Square. Build to rent, we've now consented almost 5,000 units in the city. And in terms of the importance of place quality and design, that will be at the forefront of these things. These projects, however, are not quick. My final slide. Really good quote here, I think. The important thing is that we will be looking through City Development Plan 2 towards good quality data, but it has to have a human face to it. When we say it's place focused, what does that mean? It means that we have to have sufficient diversity and access to services and physical proximity and quality, which is the reason why we're working with colleagues at the present time in terms of livable neighbourhoods with funding from Sustrans. We'll be working with you as private investors to shape development opportunities that work around the city, where we platform sites and look for Scottish Government and the output of the Land Commission to secure a pipeline of complementary measures. And as Sir Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer, said, the importance of things is that you best start from nature and nurture if you want to have good quality outcomes. Okay, that kind of completes my comments. I will now pass across to Richard MacDonald for his part of the presentation today.
Thank you, Forbes. Thank you. So again, taking inspiration from Norman Foster, as some of our architects do, we take his vision as to how, I guess, COVID is affecting everything. And there's a huge amount of activity and trends that were emerging in advance of COVID. And I think what we will see is that these trends and advances were actually happening anyway, and they've just been accelerated. So today I'm going to cover two subjects, workplace and urban centres, as to how they're affected. Next slide, please. Again, another quote from Norman Foster, and really talking about the change to workplace and the need for us to come together and collaborate, and how there may be some changes. And I guess working from home was a real novelty in the spring. There was all this sort of headlines such as the death of the office, and the British Council for Offices, the BCO, were frantically carrying out research to try and work out where we're going to go. But actually, the technology has always been there to communicate remotely. We talk about a third place, but we often work at Starbucks or airports, and office-based work, we can carry that out almost anywhere. But what was interesting is that whilst we were talking about the death of the office in the spring, by the end of the summer, there was a real yearning to be back in the workplace. And I'm not saying everybody's going to return to the workplace, but I think we do miss the face-to-face social interaction. But I think offices are going to change, and they are changing. And they've been migrating towards greener, more sociable spaces. There's been a lot of workplaces that are now being developed and repurposed and repositioned buildings. In fact, they're becoming more greener. I mean, the net zero carbon criteria for new workplaces is enhanced if you retain large portions of a building. Some of our green buildings in the past that we've designed in Aberdeen and Inverness for SEPA and SNH were perhaps ahead of their time, with a huge amount of sustainable features. We recently completed a building in Aberdeen for ACCA, and it's got a remarkable number of amenities. It's got a medical centre, a juice bar, sports facilities, creche. Those amenities were key. Next slide, please. So some of these trends and some of these fringe becoming mainstream, second home is a good example of that. So we're not looking at more of these, we're moving away from the large commercial floor space to a more intimate studio environment that's greener with co-working settings. And I think that is becoming more of the norm, and will become more of the norm as we adapt these spaces and these workplaces. So they have got far more amenities and more breakout space and more features. Next slide, please. Second home also offers a pretty extensive wellness program with a range of amenities and the ability for people to connect, people to exercise, to get some headspace, to visit the cafe within the development, and perhaps it's run by a local enterprise as opposed to a branded operator. Next slide, please. Also in Glasgow, we developed an office scheme next to an underutilised site beside the train station. And again, the win for the city there was the creation of a new plaza with green space, with open space, with amenities that break out, and also the introduction of roof terraces and other green features to enhance the space for the occupants and the visitors and users. So being beside a national rail hub, there's less reliance on cars. We're very close to the bus stations. It's almost zero cars, walkable, green, flexible space. And that's, I guess, the way the market is changing. Moving to the next slide, please. And at a much smaller scale, we're currently creating a workplace as part of the Halo development in Kilmarnock, where we have a range of facilities nearby, the net zero carbon Ayrshire College campus. We've got workplace, we've got residential, we've got a host of uses all clustered together with sport and leisure on one location, beside the train station, close to the bus station. So again, following on from Forbes' concept of a 20-minute walkable site, this trend is emerging everywhere. Next slide, please. So moving towards urban centres, again, Lord Foster's quote that COVID is actually accelerating and speeding up our the development of urban spaces and green spaces throughout cities and town centres. Forbes mentioned COP26 with the climate change conference in Glasgow. We've had the climate emergency from Greta Thunberg. All of these trends are just being speeded up. Social distancing justifies the need to have larger pedestrian zones, cycle zones, walkable cities, because we need that space. But it's interesting that the city of Glasgow is densifying and encouraging more people to live in the city, yet increasing the amount of public space with the groundbreaking Avenues project. We've talked about Amazon continuing to be more popular for retail, and the large soulless department stores are becoming redundant. So how do we repurpose that space, reposition that space? We're becoming more loyal to local businesses and local enterprises for our shopping essentials, and we're walking, we're exercising more. Next slide, please. But even on a global scale, we have Bjarke Ingels, who wants to create a world master plan to create principles in urban design and in our new cities based on technology to allow us to be sustainable and manage the way we use our resources and encourage us not to have a reliance on carbon. And we have to think differently. I mean, Big's project in Copenhagen with the waste for energy building at Copenhill, creating amenity, creating a ski slope. So if we can think slightly differently, certainly these are opportunities that can emerge. Next slide, please. Again, in Albania, we see the Tirana project, which is calling itself the first COVID resilient neighbourhood, where around 60% of the footprint area is given over to green space, with a walkable city focusing on well-being and exercise with all of the essential amenities in one place, and hardly any reliance for transport, and any transportation they're going to have in that new environment is going to be through green means. It's going to be electrical, it's going to have a light rail system that's sustainable. So they've increased more scale in the buildings to allow more open space, but there's an abundance of roof terraces and amenity spaces, all with trees and landscaping to have cleaner air and a much better environment. So this trend is emerging. This all emerged and was developing way before COVID. Next slide, please. But we've been doing this for many, many years. I mean, if anyone knows, Paddington Basin, Paddington Central with British Land, they have been using the canal as an asset. They've developed public space around residential, office space, breakout space, and that really becomes the real USP of that environment. So this is not new, but I think we have to encourage more of these types of solutions. Next slide, please. And some of our work, I mean, we've been looking at Reading Town Centre and how an underutilised city centre location, town centre location, sorry, could be repurposed. How we could take the Hexagon Theatre that's constrained and extend that facility to allow West End London shows to be played there, because the stage tower isn't sufficient for that production. Next slide. So we've created this new central space that extends the footprint of the Hexagon, allows more conference space to be linked into a hotel, with residential, with industry, with education, all clustered in one space, with a new enhanced public space, very close to rail, very close to bus interchange, so there isn't the reliance for cars. So again, this trend is emerging. Next slide, please. Forbes mentioned department stores and the effect we're having with Arcadia. In Cardiff, we're looking at a scheme which is a redundant department store, and we're repurposing that. We're demolishing some buildings in the centre of the block to create public space, to create restaurants. We're developing residential with roof gardens, and we've got workspace, we've got hotels. So we're repurposing that urban block with all the principles of the 15-minute, solution, that everybody can walk to all these amenities, and we're right in the heart of the city centre. So this is a good example of how we are looking at urban spaces in a different way and repositioning. Next slide, please. Again, in Glasgow, along the waterfront, we're involved in several new developments that we believe will all enhance the city centre and the waterfront in particular, and all based on high quality public realm. having essential amenities, having sustainable features and less reliance on the car, linked to the cycle core path network and other connections. So what we're seeing is the city itself, with their structure plans and their aspirations, we're bearing that out and developing that in our developments in support of that. Next slide, please. And even SEC, in our 30,000 square metre expansion proposals, we're taking a redundant car park to the west of the hotel complex and creating a new public realm, and with breakout space extending down to the river, again connected into the waterfront walkway and enhancing public realm. Next slide, please. On a smaller scale, well, when you can't repurpose a building, I guess what you need to do is create an adaptable, multifunctional building. This is a new building that we've just received planning consent for. Thank you, Forbes. For a new building for Rangers, which has the main feature is actually not the static space such as retail, museum, and cafe. It's actually a multifunctional space that can host community events, markets, conferences, concerts. You know, it becomes a building for Govan, not just the football club. So we need to adapt and make buildings more flexible. Final slide, thank you. So again, you know, we got some great news a few weeks ago when we qualified for the Euros. We've been quietly working away with the SFA to try and enhance the Hampton campus for Glasgow and to try and introduce other uses to improve the public realm, to improve the stadium itself. But also we've got quite an interesting concept of the Hampden Stride, which is a 1.5 metre pedestrian route from the city centre to the stadium, again encouraging exercise. So I guess in summary, we believe that both workplace and urban centres had emerging trends, and we do believe COVID has just really accelerated these trends, but in a very positive way. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk, and I'll hand you over to Ranald. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, what really struck me was where all these things overlap in what both you and Forbes talked about. The common themes are coming through all the time, and what I've seen in other presentations is about how in industry and insurance and in all sorts of other sectors, these same issues are coming up. So I'll skip into it. My name's Ray Boydell. I'm an architect registered in Australia. I hasten to add, not here, but been based back in the UK since 2006 now. I'm passionate about bringing sustainability into mainstream practice, and to that end, EcoHouse Live is my latest push into that. Next slide, please. But the question today was what next for where we live, and I phrased that in the context of the future normal house. What will future normal be? Next slide, please. Just last week, I was on another of these webinars where we were all sat watching little boxes on the screen of other people speak. And this one was about selling a lifestyle. Is styling key to attracting home buyers? And the closing question, well, what will be the #1 issue for selling a house in 2021? And the answer from Nina Coulter of Savills was sustainability. One word, nothing else, sustainability. That's it as far as she was concerned. Next slide, thanks. So my question is, what will that future house look like in 10 years' time? What will the house of 2030 look like compared to today? That happens to be a colour home. Other brands are available. Next slide, please. So comparing to that, is it going to be some idyllic utopia vision for 2030? Next slide, please. Or is it going to be dystopia, where climate change is wreaking havoc around the world? Next slide. Is it going to be completely high-tech, where we're cocooned from everything going on out in the natural environment? Next slide, please. Or is it going to be back to nature and foraging for nuts and berries? And be aware, this episode of Grand Designs is the most watched back. People do get appeal from this sort of thing. Next slide, please. But actually, I think that's what they'll look like. They'll look very normal. They'll look very much like what we have now. And why do I have that? Next slide, please. Because if we look back 100 years, they look pretty much the same. Next slide, please. 200 years, same again. Next slide. We actually have to go back more than 300 years to find anything that doesn't look vaguely like what a house looks like today. Next slide, please. So the point there, it's not actually about what a house looks like, it's about how it performs. Now, this is the autonomous house in Nottingham, built back in the early 90s, so 30 odd years old now. It's in the middle of Nottingham, it's in a conservation area, and the council planners, Forbes, said it's going to have to comply with the heritage guidelines. And the architect said, yeah, that's fine. It's not about what a building looks like, it's about how it's performing. And in Robert Vowell's words, he said, if we are proposing something that changes the way houses are serviced, it is perhaps too much demand that people also have to change their expectation of what a house should look like. Next slide, please. And so that really makes a point. It's about performance. It's about when we pull the whole structure of the house apart, how does it operate? It's not what it looks like on the outside, it's what's in between the walls, it's what's up in the roof, it's what's making it tick in the plant roof that really counts. Next slide, please. So what's the precedent for this sort of change? There's a quote attributed to Henry Ford, although it's questionable whether he actually said it, but the point remains valid. The point was, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And the perception is there that people just want a better normal, whereas what they're really wanting is a better performance. And if you look at the body of a car compared to the body of a horse carriage, there wasn't much difference back in those days. It's just the horsepower was a bit of technology under the bonnet, not the living beast out on the road. Next slide, please. And so what did that transition from the horse and carriage to the car look like? There's this classic comparison of photos. Fifth Avenue, New York, 1900, spot the car. All of those vehicles are horse and carriages, except for that one in the red circle. Next slide. 10 years later, or just over, spot the horse and carriage. It's completely transformed. There's just one horse and carriage there amidst all those cars. And it's worth pointing out, the automated production of the Model T Ford only started in 1913. That transition didn't happen because of automated mass production. The transition happened because the old model had already become obsolete. Next slide, please. And that's the point of this famous quote by Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. Change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So in terms of housing, what that obsolescence is about the performance. Next slide, please. So what are the drivers for that at the moment? There's a lot of them. There's net zero carbon, which is about operational energy use. There's low embodied carbon, which is about the construction carbon impacts. We need to be resource efficient, and that speaks to the circular economy model. And we need to be adaptable, as we all are sitting here today working from home. It's about health and well-being, where certainly COVID has ramped up our awareness significantly. But it's also broader environmental awareness issues, things like biodiversity, and it's about being connected. Again, both Forbes and Richard spoke to those two things. Next slide, please. So what are the emerging regulations and policies about homes? Well, we already know that no new build homes are going to be on the gas by 2024-25. That's just a few years away. The EPC bans are coming in, particularly in Scotland. There's already ramped up requirements for social housing and private lets, private sales coming on the way too. In terms of planning policy, we're seeing minimum standards coming in and mandates for district heating. Glasgow City Council has certainly been one of the ringleaders on that, and that really shakes up what home builders can expect to supply. Also, building regulations are going to increase. I'm not overly optimistic about the pace of change on those, but it's certainly one factor. If you look in the GLA area in London by comparison, large projects already have to comply with various guidelines for embodied carbon and circular economy as they go through planning. If you look at big documents like the industrial strategy with the ambition of halving energy use by 2030, and that's one of the many references where that 2030 date is coming in. But there are sooner dates as well. The Futures Home Standards down in England is scheduled for 2025, but there's some speculation that's going to be brought forward. And for companies, we're seeing mandatory reporting for things like carbon and sustainability. Next slide, please. All of that feeds into the fact that if we're building things now which don't meet those performance standards, we're going to end up with a stranded asset. And this is recognised within the real estate industry. And a particularly good quote there from the German-based GRESB. I don't know what the initials stand for, but it's all about applying ESG investment principles to the real estate industry. Next slide, please. So what's happening here? The Scottish National Investment Bank has just been launched. Their primary mission is the transition to net zero. If you look broader within the UK and the whole green recovery thing, it's quoted as saying they're going to deliver the biggest upgrade of the nation's buildings in a generation. You get things like green mortgages coming out from banks like Barclays. And just last week, I saw an article in Investment Week where John David from Rathbones was quoted talking about issues related to biodiversity. So again, there are all sorts of issues playing into the finance of these things. Next slide, please. And if you take that down to the smaller level, to the buying and selling of an individual home, you know, all of these different organisations representing the mortgage lenders, the property valuations, the homeowner's warranty, and all the things that go with type approvals for new homes, all of those organisations are paying heed to sustainability. Next slide, please. So how do we achieve that performance and how do we certify that performance? Passive House is the brand that is most globally recognised and goes for very high energy efficiency. Really importantly there's no performance gap. They do what they say on the tin, they really do deliver. But there is a perception they're expensive and inflexible, and it certainly doesn't address the broader sustainability issues. Next slide, please. But there are lots of different schemes that do. Here in the UK, the Home Quality Mark from the BRE is the most well-resolved example, although it's had very little market uptake. In Australia, as a comparison, they've got a future home strategy that the Green Building Council is putting together. It's in a pilot stage. But bigger picture, there's a really interesting one called Active House, which is a really strong collaboration between industry, academics and the consumer, and has a very strong EU presence. Or another one called Edge, which has some mandatory reporting on carbon and circular economy type issues developed by the World Bank. And interestingly, the UK government is the main government supporter of that program at the moment. It's very big in developing countries, but equally applicable to developed countries as well. Next slide, please. So we did a bit of our own research on this just on 2 years ago now, when the Multiply Agency did a survey for us asking about sustainable homes. And there was overwhelming support from that, from the consumer. So 83% of people saying that sustainability would be important for the next home. Next slide, please. 83% same stat saying that they wanted a house to be as self-sufficient as possible. That was really interesting. Self-sufficiency came up in a lot of responses, and we weren't anticipating there was going to be such awareness of that. Next slide, please. But perhaps most telling were the open comments, when people could just say anything they wanted. And the comments were overwhelmingly negative about builders, that they weren't building this bloody stuff in the first place. But also optimism that actually, if we can pursue this model, that they would be a really positive future for home building. Next slide, please. So what does this all come down to? This standard is possible now. It's readily available materials, it's proven technologies, it's standard construction techniques. It's not rocket science, it's not waiting for a magic bullet. There are 5 simple things. Highly energy efficient fabric, renewable energy technology, but only where it's appropriate. Sometimes you're better off just staying connected to the grid. We need to reduce embodied impact, that's embodied carbon and circular economy. And if I was going to say there's one standout issue that the construction industry is going to have to deal with, or 2 issues, it's embodied carbon and circular economy. Get ready, you're going to have to do it. Health and well-being, everything post-COVID, and back to that issue about being connected. Next slide, please. So the key question, what does it cost? Estimates range from anything from just a few percent up to maybe 10 or 20%. But my answer to that is we need to manage the cost by addressing practical issues. This is what we do in the construction industry. We always have budget overruns. We always have to find a way to manage around that budget. The things we need to do are we need to prioritise sustainability so it's integrated. We need the economies of scale that come with mass market and engaging with our supply chain. We need to see renewables as an investment with a return on investment separate from the construction cost. We do need to recognise the value for money. We're getting a better quality product, and you are going to have to pay for that, but you get the benefits of the comfort and durability that comes with that. And you also get the higher valuation, and you don't end up with a stranded asset. Thank you. Next slide. So that's just the front page of our new website, ecohouse.live, and we're hoping that we can get home buyers and home builders to get involved with us in this, to start seeing how we can get this into the mass market. And I think there's one concluding slide, but thank you very much. That's it from me.
Well, some inspiring presentations there. So thank you, gentlemen. Much appreciated. Participating is very welcome. And on the bottom bar, you'll see the little Q&A box. So please feel free to file your questions to these panelists. So far, we've got one question come in, so I'm hoping for some more, but we'll kick off with the one we have, which is addressed to Forbes, and it says, there was no mention of vehicle traffic in your presentation. Do you envisage a place for private transport? And if not, how do you envisage public transport rising to the challenge?
I suppose what comes to mind in the current circumstances, the unpredictability or predictability, depending on what particular issue you're looking at, of the circumstances that come at us, and the importance within all that of resilience. Now, what we are all saying in the kind of 20-minute prism is that it's walking and cycling are the most resilient and the most flexible in terms of accessibility, and the fact that you don't actually need to particularly rely upon these other modes of transport. If you look at the current time, public transport use, because of the health issues, has become quite problematic in terms of people's perception of it. And private car use is the one that has recovered most quickly to very close to normal levels because it gives the perception of safety. So a very long way around to say, I think the question is entirely reasonable, but I didn't directly address it in my sort of comments because I think this is much more about the possibility of us having the ability to get services much closer to and more resiliently within that 20-minute parameter. So for, as I say, for walking, that could be mile and a half. For cycling could be 5-6 miles. In the climate we live in, we have to be realistic and recognize that at certain times of the year that some of these modes are quite problematic. So you might want to spend that day working from home or the second day working from home, which I think we've kind of tested that model to destruction at the present time. I think what I'm loath to do is to say private bad, because there's a whole range of mobility issues there which are far more complex than just modal. If we have the ability to give greater priority to walking and cycling, I think our place quality quite often improves. We also have to recognize, though, that when you have areas which, for example, are pedestrianized, that might be an appropriate response during the day, but in the evenings, that can sometimes be quite an uncivilizing factor if you, for example, don't have buses or taxis moving through. So I guess as much as anything, yes, I think private car usage will be constrained longer term. It will be probably decarbonized. But I do think that we, at the risk of saying it's that mode and that mode, it's probably a far more nuanced discussion. And I think it should be much more around about improving the quality of people's living and work environments, and in terms of the 24-hour nature of that experience as well, because at the risk of otherwise perhaps throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you, Forbes. That's great. Another question has come in. How important, I think, Richard, this will be one for you. How important and practical is the refurbishment of existing commercial buildings to other new uses versus new build?
It's a good question. I think we are seeing a trend emerging at the moment that there's a lot of repositioning and repurposing of buildings, not just for workplace, but for other uses. And I think there is, it's certainly a greener solution if we can protect an asset and we don't go for wholesale demolition. And I think adapting buildings and changing changing the character of the space and enhancing those buildings actually can have more character than say a bland new build solution, because there is history and heritage there. We're going to have to do more of this because of the changing nature of retail trends in town centres. We're going to have to be more flexible in the way we look at land use and different uses within the block both vertically and horizontally, and how it connects back to public space. So I think we have to have an open mind. I certainly think it's the next generation of town centre redevelopment is going to have a lot more repurposed, repositioned buildings as opposed to wholesale new build. But we can't rule out new build. There will be circumstances where the purpose of the building will demand specific space that on merit, it may have to replace existing buildings. We just have to accept that. And it's about the performance and energy that that building consumes in its new specification, in its new features, and how we weigh that up against the existing asset. There's always going to be constraints with existing buildings. And you know, I guess as Forbes sort of explained, that we need to take each individual case on its merits. But it's interesting at the moment, the practice is working on a number of fairly complex, interesting existing buildings that we're developing, and we're repurposing them. And that seems to be a consistent trend.
Thank you. The next question, how will new homes, I think Ranald, this will be one for you. How will new homes be heated after 2024, 2025? And how important will district heating be compared to other technologies?
The simple answer to heating is probably heat pumps. Heat pumps are going to become the most common form of heating in new build homes. And for anybody who doesn't know heat pump technology, it's really just fridges working backwards. It's not complicated. It's not new technology. It's just old technology being applied in a new way. District heating, potentially very important. I think district heating is going to be much more important in established urban areas than it is for new build homes. It's the middle of Glasgow. It's the middle of Edinburgh, where we need district heating systems going in. Having said that, it also depends on the source. So out at Shawfair on the edge of Edinburgh and Midlothian, that's very likely to get a district heating coming in off the Miller Hill Waste to Energy facility. So it makes sense there because you've got a waste heat source. If you look at Clydebank in Glasgow, they've got wastewater heat recovery or water-based heat recovery heat pumps coming into the developments over there. But the key in all of this is actually we need to make the buildings more energy efficient, because a new build home should be so energy efficient that we hardly need any space heating. We still need hot water, and hot water might actually be delivered best through electricity or solar thermal panels on the roof. If you make your building energy efficient enough, you don't need space heating, even in a cold climate like us for all but the worst days of winter. So there's a mixed answer to that, but I mean, the overriding thing is first reduce your energy use before you worry about what the heat source is.
I mean, one of the comments I'd make, Ranald, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but if you look at the kind of tax position on district heating systems in Scotland, it is quite problematic and quite, you know, sort of a block to actually broaden the implementation. The experience that we had down at the Commonwealth Games Village with that it's been really very traumatic, I think, in terms of the financial implications around that. So I don't know whether you got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I don't know the details of it, but I do know in the Scottish Government's programme for last year, they were looking at regulations for district heating. And I'm not sure where that's gotten to, but it is crucially important because, yeah, electricity and gas is all thoroughly regulated. There are strong systems for it. And in the absence of that with district heating, it is on the back foot, and that needs to be resolved. Yeah.
Perhaps on a similar theme, one of the questions that's come in is, does the panel think that the industry will deliver in advance of legislation? I'm going to take that as the wider real estate industry rather than just being residential. But will the buildings that are delivered in advance of legislation head towards environmental friendly standards, or would legislation be required or building standards be required to drive this? Gentlemen, any of you can answer that really. What's your thoughts in terms of are people willing to be pushing ahead with more environmentally friendly buildings, or are people going to have to be dragged to it?
I don't mind taking this on. I mean, I guess we've all got a social conscience to do the right thing and advance those technologies. And it used to be that in real estate, it was all about location, location, location. Now it's about location, location, energy. So I think the real estate funders and developers and marketeers and agents will be promoting these new technologies, which will add value to assets. So I think there will be an advance, and there are a number of developers such as say, Derwent UK or British Land and others that are pursuing greener, more sustainable projects because they know that the product that they will build and will have a higher real estate value at the end of it, because it's going to be ahead of the opposition. And I think regulation will catch up, but I do think we're going to see more and more innovation from the real estate market in advance of that.
I agree with Richard, and I'd make the link to it's the big picture position which is going to dictate it. The small scale regulations is probably going to be slow to catch up. Building regulations are going to be too slow. They're not going to do it. But what we have is the Climate Change Act, which says by 2050 we're going to be net zero. And Christine Figueres, who led the Paris Agreement, made the comment that when we went from 80% to 100% reduction, so to the net zero target, she made the point that up until then, every industry was trying to argue why they should be in the 20% exception, why they should not have to decarbonise. And as soon as it got to the point where there are no exceptions, you are all decarbonising, that argument goes out the window. And then it becomes to industry's advantage to try and get there sooner, to try and get the market advantage to deliver it before their competitor does. So her prediction was actually we would get there much sooner than 2050 because of that competitive advantage. So for me, it's that high level aspiration which is going to set the trend. The smaller scale regulations, they won't do it. People just see those as hurdles to jump over.
And I suppose just to add to what you just said, Reynold, that I mean, if the Scottish Government was saying through MPF4, the consultation and everything else is saying that the target is net zero emissions, and the only difference between Scottish Government and UK Government and City Government in Glasgow is about the timing of that, then at least there's a clarity about objectives. And as Richard was saying, if there's actually self-interest there in terms of commercial value as well, it helps everybody to align. And so at some stage, you know, that, yeah, to answer the question, that there perhaps does need to be some compulsion in this, but at least everyone's kind of well cited in terms of that route map there and the reasons for it, because it makes it much easier for everybody.
Thank you. I've received a note from David just to say that the stage 1 debate on heat networks is actually being debated today in Parliament. So the Scottish Government is definitely moving forward in relation to legislation surrounding heat networks, which will be an interesting thing for us all to have to grapple with going forward in the future. Just another question that's come in, directed to Richard. In terms of the schemes that you've gone through, providing green space, sustainability and future-proofing for changes, how has local and central government helped to facilitate, and could they do anything more?
I suppose a lot of our projects, we put green space at the heart of the concept, and there hasn't really been, I think, recently any resistance to us providing additional green space in public realm. In fact, there's been encouragement from most officials, whether it be national or local. Certainly, you know, a good example is in most of our new waterfront projects, our developer is actually encouraging additional green space because it really helps the saleability and viability of their scheme. So in terms of the framework, there are minimum standards that we have to adhere to, but we often enhance these minimum standards for green space as a trade-off, and where we can maybe create more density and other features. But we never really come across any resistance in our schemes to providing better public realm and amenities. Perhaps there could be more consistency between different local authorities or between different government departments. But generally, the whole agenda is moving towards better open space, green space, and most of our clients that commission us for work have got that on their agenda as well. So it seems to be in a good balance at the moment. Certainly, we could probably do with maybe slightly less density in some instances where we can create more green space. But generally, it's on everybody's agenda to improve the environment in and around our buildings and around our spaces. So we find it very encouraging dealing with local authority and national government on that issue at the moment.
Thank you.
Add anything to that, Forbes?
And you won't trap me with my mute again. So yeah, no, I think that there's a commercial value to a lot of these things, as well as obviously the obvious benefits in terms of the immediate quality of the residential environments and the office environments. So I think there's a self-interest there to be aligned.
I'm very conscious of time and we're close to the end of the seminar. So I have one last question, which we'll ask, and it's directed to Forbes. Was the Glasgow gold standard for new homes an effective policy action, or was it compromised in delivery?
And I think I would indicate that at the front end of that, because it was a bit of a shock to people, it was hard work for all concerned. But I think ultimately it's worked out to be a positive thing for some of the reasons that Richard's outlined there, that people start to see what initially is quite challenging because they have certain designs which they bring forward in expectation, and then discover that there are actually ways of incorporating the gold standard into a range of uses which allow the targets to be met. But at the front end, I think it's like all things, it's about adaptability, and that sometimes can be a tricky part when people aren't given the full context. But once they get a context and once they see that there are means and ways of achieving it, then I think people are less frightened by it.
Thank you, Forbes. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of our hour on this topic. And so thank you everyone for joining us. It seems very positive. Everyone generally seems to be moving in the right direction. And no doubt there will be challenges to be ironed out. And many of us on this call will no doubt debate those challenges with one another as we try and actually bring development forward. But thank you all for joining us today. And we'll look forward to trying to bring some other topics forward for you across the course of the year to keep you entertained. In the meantime, we'll sign off for now. Thanks, everyone.